On November 8, 1972, a small Beechcraft 18 lifted off from Cambridge Bay in Canada's Northwest Territories. The pilot was Martin Hartwell, a 46-year-old German-born bush pilot with years of northern flying experience. He was transporting 3 passengers south to Yellowknife. One was a pregnant Inuk woman named Naimi Nuliayak, 27 years old, in need of urgent medical care. Beside her sat David Kootook, a 14-year-old Inuk boy suffering from appendicitis. The third passenger was a British nurse named Judy Hill, accompanying the patients. The flight was routine. The weather was not. Somewhere over the vast frozen wilderness, Martin Hartwell flew into a whiteout. Visibility dropped to nothing. The instruments offered little help in the featureless terrain. At some point, disoriented and descending too early, the aircraft struck a hillside in the remote Mackenzie Mountains. The impact was catastrophic. The Beechcraft shattered on frozen ground, scattering wreckage across the snow. Judy Hill died instantly. Naimi Nuliayak, critically injured, would survive only a few hours. Martin Hartwell regained consciousness in the broken cockpit, his ankles shattered, his knee badly damaged. Nearby, David Kootook was alive, injured but conscious. The 2 survivors now faced a single, simple reality. They were alone. The temperature dropped as night fell. -30. -40. The wind cut through the shattered fuselage without mercy. Martin Hartwell could not walk. His ankles were broken, one severely. His knee was damaged. Every small movement sent pain through his lower body. David Kootook, despite his own injuries, became the one who moved. The boy gathered what he could from the wreckage. Sleeping bags. A small amount of food. A tarpaulin. He built a rough shelter against the broken aircraft, blocking some of the wind. He collected snow and melted it for drinking water. He tended to the pilot as best he could. Days passed. The emergency locator transmitter had been destroyed in the crash. No signal went out. No one knew where they were. Search aircraft flew patterns across the north, but the Mackenzie Mountains are vast. The wreckage was small. The snow made everything white. Hartwell and Kootook waited. The food ran out within the first week. Hartwell, immobile and starving, watched the boy work. David Kootook did not complain. He did not panic. He simply continued. Day after day. Melting snow. Adjusting the shelter. Keeping them both alive. By the second week, Martin Hartwell had not moved from his position. His legs were useless. The pain had become constant, a dull presence he could no longer separate from the cold. David Kootook continued to function. The boy was sick. His appendicitis had not been treated. The pain in his abdomen grew worse each day. Yet he did not stop. He could not stop. Without him, the pilot would die. The Arctic winter showed no mercy. Storms came and went. Temperatures remained far below zero. The shelter held, barely. Hartwell later described the boy's quiet endurance in simple terms. He did what needed to be done. No complaints. No tears. Just work. Melting snow. Checking the shelter. Sitting beside the pilot through the long frozen nights. Somewhere out there, search teams were still looking. Over 30 aircraft participated in the search at its peak. Thousands of square miles were covered. But the crash site was remote, the wreckage blended into the snow, and the emergency transmitter was silent. The 2 survivors had no way of knowing if anyone was still searching. They had no way of knowing anything at all. They simply waited. And the boy kept them alive. The third week began without rescue. David Kootook grew weaker. His untreated appendicitis was now a constant agony. He moved less. He spoke less. But still he worked. Still he melted snow. Still he checked on the pilot. Martin Hartwell would later testify that the boy never gave up. Not once. The food had been gone for days. The cold was relentless. The shelter offered minimal protection. Hartwell, immobile and starving, faced a decision that would haunt the rest of his life. The bodies of Judy Hill and Naomi Nuliayak lay preserved in the frozen snow nearby. At some point during the third week, Martin Hartwell began to eat human flesh. He would later admit this publicly. He did not hide it. He did not justify it. He simply stated what happened. He needed calories to survive. There was no other source. David Kootook refused. The boy would not participate. Despite his own starvation, despite his worsening illness, despite the certainty of death, David Kootook refused to consume human remains. He continued to care for the pilot. He continued to melt snow. He continued until his body could no longer function. On day 23, David Kootook died quietly inside the shelter. Martin Hartwell was now alone. The boy who had kept him alive for 23 days was gone. The pilot could not walk. He could not leave the shelter. He could not signal for help. He could only wait. And eat. And try not to freeze. The days blurred together. Hartwell later described this period in fragmented terms. Time lost meaning. The cold was constant. The silence was absolute. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He did not know if rescue would come. He did not know if anyone was still looking. He simply existed. 1 hour at a time. One breath at a time. Outside, the search had not stopped. It had expanded. Over 30 aircraft. Hundreds of personnel. The Canadian military. Civilian volunteers. The largest air search in Canadian history to that point. But the Mackenzie Mountains do not give up their secrets easily. The terrain was brutal. The weather was worse. And a small wrecked aircraft buried in snow on a remote hillside was nearly invisible from the air. Hartwell had no way of knowing any of this. He lay in the shelter. He waited. He survived. 30 days passed. Then 31. Then 32. On December 9, 1972, 32 days after the crash, a search aircraft spotted the wreckage. The pilot was a bush flyer named Chuck McAvoy, flying a systematic grid pattern over the mountains. He saw a dark shape against the snow. Then another. Then the unmistakable outline of a broken fuselage. He circled. He radioed the coordinates. Within hours, a rescue helicopter was dispatched. The terrain made landing impossible near the crash site. A military team was lowered by cable onto the frozen hillside. They approached the wreckage expecting to recover bodies. Instead, they found Martin Hartwell alive. He was conscious. He was coherent. He was severely emaciated, frostbitten, and unable to stand. But he was alive. The rescuers wrapped him in thermal blankets and prepared him for extraction. As they worked, they saw the other bodies. Judy Hill. Naomi Nuliayak. David Kootook. All frozen. All dead. And they saw evidence of what Hartwell had done to survive. No one spoke of it immediately. That would come later. For now, the priority was getting the survivor out. Martin Hartwell was lifted into the helicopter and flown to Yellowknife. After 32 days in the frozen wilderness, he was finally rescued. Martin Hartwell was hospitalized in Yellowknife and later transferred to Edmonton. His injuries were severe. Both ankles had been broken in the crash. One had become badly infected. Doctors were forced to amputate part of his left foot. His knee required multiple surgeries. The frostbite damage was extensive. But physically, he would survive. The harder question was what came next. Within days of his rescue, rumors began to circulate. The rescue team had seen things at the crash site. Evidence that could not be ignored. Journalists began asking questions. Investigators began compiling reports. And Martin Hartwell, still recovering in hospital, made a decision. He would not hide. He would not lie. On December 19, 1972, Martin Hartwell publicly admitted that he had consumed human flesh to survive. The admission shocked the country. It dominated headlines. It sparked fierce public debate. Some condemned him without reservation. Some argued he had no other choice. Ethicists, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens weighed in. The question was simple but impossible to answer cleanly. What would you do? What should anyone do? Hartwell offered no defense beyond the facts. He was starving. There was no food. He wanted to live. An official inquiry was launched. The Canadian government needed answers. Not just about the cannibalism, but about the crash itself. About the decisions made. About who was responsible. Martin Hartwell testified. He described the flight. The whiteout. The disorientation. The impact. He described the days that followed. The cold. The injuries. The boy who kept him alive. And he described what he did after David Kootook died. The inquiry concluded that Hartwell had made navigational errors. He had descended too early, relying on visual references that did not exist in the whiteout. The crash was determined to be pilot error. But on the matter of cannibalism, no charges were filed. Canadian law did not explicitly address the consumption of human remains in survival situations. There was no legal framework for prosecution. Ethically, the debate continued for years. But legally, Martin Hartwell was not held accountable for that choice. The inquiry also examined the actions of David Kootook. The 14-year-old boy who refused to eat human flesh. Who cared for an injured man for over 3 weeks. Who worked until his body failed. The official record described his conduct as extraordinary. Words like courage and selflessness appeared in the final report. But those words felt inadequate for what the boy had done. In 1994, more than 2 decades after the crash, David Kootook was posthumously awarded the Meritorious Service Cross by the Canadian government. The citation praised his courage, perseverance, and selflessness. It described how a sick, injured 14-year-old boy had kept an adult man alive for 23 days in impossible conditions. It acknowledged that he did this while refusing to compromise his own principles. The award was presented to his surviving family members in a quiet ceremony. For many, it was long overdue. David Kootook had become a symbol. Not of survival at any cost, but of survival with dignity. Of choosing how to live, even when facing certain death. Martin Hartwell returned to flying after his recovery. He continued to work as a bush pilot in the Canadian North for many years. He rarely spoke publicly about the crash. When he did, he spoke of David Kootook with respect and gratitude. He never denied what he had done. He never apologized for wanting to live. He simply carried it with him. In 2013, Martin Hartwell died at the age of 87. The official record of the 1972 crash remains one of the most studied survival cases in Canadian history. It is taught in aviation schools. It is discussed in ethics courses. And at the center of it, always, is the boy who refused. The wreckage of the Beechcraft 18 was eventually removed from the mountainside. The site returned to silence. Snow fell and melted. Seasons passed. The Mackenzie Mountains continued as they always had, indifferent to what happened there. But the story did not disappear. It was passed down. Written about. Studied. Debated. And at the heart of every retelling was the same impossible question. What would you do? There is no clean answer. There never was. Martin Hartwell chose to live by any means necessary. David Kootook chose to live on his own terms, even if it meant dying. Neither choice was wrong. Neither was entirely right. They were simply human. Two people, trapped in an impossible situation, making decisions that would define them forever. The Arctic does not judge. It does not forgive or condemn. It simply is. Cold. Vast. Silent. And somewhere in that silence, the memory of a 14-year-old boy remains. A boy who melted snow. Who built a shelter. Who cared for a stranger. Who refused to abandon his principles. Who died quietly, with dignity, in a frozen shelter in the middle of nowhere. His name was David Kootook. And this was his story as much as anyone's.